The last section today will address the Christchurch earthquake, which all of us have been familiar at one level or other. We have a set of speakers. Nicholas Hill and Stu Geddes will be sharing the presentation. Mr. Nick Hill is also on the Directors Governing Council of the Global Membership Council. He's the Chief Executive of the Building Officials Institute of New Zealand, the peak body representing the building surveying and building control sectors, a position he has held for 5 years. The Institute is dedicated in New Zealand to improving the professionalism and ongoing skill sets of both its members and the wider building and construction sector. Nick is a member of the International Code Council's Governing Committee and also the president of the Australasian Society of Association Executives, having co-led the recent New Zealand and Australian merger. His other roles and responsibilities include board member of the Australasian Certification Authority for Structural and Reinforced Steels, a member of the New Zealand's Construction Industry Council, a Wellington District Councillor for the New Zealand Automobile Association, and a board member and industry advisor rep on a number of New Zealand government initiatives attached to the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Nick's broad sector exposure includes industrial chemicals, illumination engineering, electrical wholesaling, construction, and motor industry. And if I may also introduce Stu Geddes, who is the president of the Building Officials Institute of New Zealand. Stu has been involved in the construction industry for 40 years, with the last 24 in building control in various councils around New Zealand. His various roles have ranged from on-the-ground inspections, building control management roles, and to oversee building control departments. Stu is currently working for the Queenstown Lakes District Council as a senior building control officer based in the picturesque Wanaka in New Zealand South Island. Stu is the current president of the Building Officials Institute of New Zealand and has been an institute board member for 9 years. With considerable experience built over a long career in building construction industry and in the building control extended family, is well respected for this knowledge in this sector. And he would like to share his experience from the Christchurch earthquakes from an on-ground perspective, going door to door, conducting rapid assessment. I presume Nick and Stu, you'll be sharing the presentation in sequence. Again, welcome Nick Hill.
Thank you, Raj, and thank you everybody for staying around. I'll see if I can get this over by midnight. Look, there's been some great presentations and lots of shared synergies and experiences. And I particularly liked the comment by Ahmad with regards to his concerns about the understanding of the building codes in relation to architects. I actually now think that's a global generalisation and we should actually cast it in stone. We have those similar experiences in the Antipodes. David, I really did appreciate your B2B and moving on from Loma Prieta. I thought that was great. Public-private partnerships, I think, have a place, and I think that what I'm going to show you is that as an institute, we actually performed part of the private component in Christchurch. Next. So the agenda today is I'm going to speak about the rapid building evaluation process getting started, and then Stu Geddes, our president, is going to talk about life on the ground at the coalface, and then Ron Dickinson, who was in Christchurch following the earthquake, who's just down here, will speak about the long journey ahead of the Christchurch rebuild. So that's next. Righty-ho. I think the key is that rapid building evaluation needs to be proactive, it needs to be innovative, and you've got to actually focus on the necessary. And part of what we needed to do was actually focus on the necessary. We have a very strong structure in terms of civil defence management in New Zealand, but it wasn't as good as we thought it was when the crunch came. So in terms of the overview of the event, we had obviously two major significant events, and you'll see that there. One was 7.1 in magnitude, but the one that really caused the problems was 6.3 on the 27th of February 2011, and that's what we're going to focus on today. I'm not going to go through all of this. You can probably read that. But next, you'll see that's the Christchurch that I grew up in. And I was there for about 20-something years, and it was a great place. My family owned about 86 buildings in Christchurch. Luckily, we actually sold them before the earthquake, which was marvellous. But what you see in Christchurch is 100 and something years of building ageing, and I'm going to walk you through some of the pictures in terms of what we experienced and the types of building casualties. The important part that I think is worth noting is that we actually had a significant event in 1931, which was a couple of years before the big Nepal one, which caused the formation of our building codes and standards in a more robust way. And that certainly did help the outcome in Christchurch in terms of fatalities, as sad as they were. Here is the next slide here shows bird's eye view of Christchurch, and you can actually see that the river, where you see the green foliage, there is the significant impact in the CPD there was around the river area. That shot was probably taken about 2 years ago. So there are still a lot of those buildings are down now. There are 7,700 buildings which were dropped and demolished in the Christchurch CBD. Next. With regards to the immediate aftermath, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this. Following the first earthquake in September, a lot of the unreinforced masonry buildings were further damaged, and we've got some good pictures of those. The significant liquefaction actually produced 400,000 tonnes of silt, not 40, that's a typo up there. And we, as other commentators have said, we lost a significant number of people. 185 people died. But they came from, interestingly, 20 countries. And a big part of New Zealand's economy is educating foreigners. A significant number actually came from Japan, which was very sad. Pretty well straight away, within an hour or so, Christchurch was declared a state of national emergency, and what we saw fairly quickly within weeks was a departure of about 70,000 people. 40,000 very, very quickly after the earthquakes, but they believe it's around about 70,000 since. And if you listen to Lucy earlier on, the recovery of cities after an earthquake depends on the speed of the bureaucracy to bring the city back to life. And we haven't had a significant improvement in Christchurch since the earthquake. The central city is still very barren. It's it's devoid of a lot of business activity, and a lot of the residents that are left are unlikely to come back. In terms of what was the immediate response with regards to the instigation of the emergency program, very quickly a central red zone was established, and that was quite important because the structural integrity of the buildings in the CPD were quite severe. There were 3 programs instigated in terms of how the building response would be managed. There was Operation CBD, there was Operation Shop, and there was Operation Suburb, and I'm going to be talking about Operation Suburb. Operation CBD was very much a lockdown of the central city. Operation Shop was the program that would get the commercial sector up and going as quickly as possible, and particularly the supermarkets. It was very important that the supermarkets were brought back to life, for want of a better terminology, so that there was the ability for the citizens of Christchurch to actually get supplies was available. There's some more information there, but by mid-afternoon on the 22nd of February, the Department of Building Housing was in touch with our office, the Civil Defence and the Ministry, which is the Department of Building Housing, realised that there was a flaw in their response plan. They couldn't mobilise building surveyors as quickly as we could. We're an organisation of 1,200 building surveyors. We have the database, so they came to us fairly quickly, so I had a meeting within a couple of hours of the earthquake. And actually, in fact, we felt the earthquake in Wellington, in my office, because I'm about 12 stories up. And interestingly, we thought it was just a minor shake and didn't think much of it. The people in Christchurch actually thought, even though it was a major shake in Christchurch, they thought that Wellington was absolutely flattened. And that was the perception of most of New Zealand, that when the big quake came, it was always going to hit Wellington first. Interestingly enough, it was Christchurch. The next slide, I think if we go one more, I think that is what we called the red zone. That was the closing down of the inner CBD area. And there's probably a couple of square miles, or 3 or 4 square miles in the central city there that was actually locked off. The buildings themselves were severely damaged. And if you go to the next slide, you'll start seeing a couple buildings that I'm quite familiar with. On the top left-hand side is the Aviemore Educational College. The quake hit about lunchtime, but if the timing had been any different, there would have been 200 or 300 people in that building. Now that's a 1930s building. The one below it is the CTV building, which is the building that had the biggest number of fatalities. 115 were killed in that, and that was a tiered collapse that only left the tower standing. That subsequently there was a significant fire in that building. There were small minor fires in the CBD, but nothing that is in comparison to that. If you go to the central column of those photos, the top building itself, the top building there is another 1930s building, and then you go back, you go to the buildings below that, and you get to the pre-turn of the last century. And they're the buildings that my family owned, and the front basically peeled away, and that's unreinforced masonry building stock. And that is where a significant number of people were also killed as they ran out of buildings. If they'd actually stayed in the buildings, they probably would have stood a better chance. And a couple of shots to the right-hand side of car park collapses where the columns had failed. Next slide. Look, here's my interpretation of the organisation of Operation Suburb. If you take the large oval diagram in the centre, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and the Civil Defence Emergency Management Team coordinated the defence response, and pretty well off to the wings you can see the usual suspects that are involved in emergency response. There's USAR, Red Cross, the armed forces, the police, the local government jurisdiction, which is the Christchurch City Council, and as Lucy mentioned earlier, the Earthquake Commission. That's our insurance facility. Every homeowner that carries insurance contributes to a Earthquake Commission policy, I've forgotten the amount, but let's arguably say it's $1 for every $100 that you contribute in insurance that goes into that pocket. Above that line, the Department of Building and Housing, directly above the large oval area, coordinated the response of the building professionals. You've got the engineers, the architects, and ourselves, the building surveyors. And effectively, we were the building evaluation team on the ground. But Stu will talk to you about that a little bit more. Next. So just looking at the time frames, you can see that 6.3 magnitude earthquake hit at around just after noon. We were contacted within a couple of hours later, as I already mentioned. we were also part of the decision to send two teams from the department to Christchurch immediately. They were flown in, and we also started to work with some of our local government councils to get BCOs, building control officials, or building surveyors working in local government into the Christchurch area from the South Island. So if you don't know much about New Zealand, we're two islands, and Christchurch is pretty well in the centre of the southern island. The next day, we worked with the department to initiate a recruitment plan, subject to the Civil Defence approval. And I think the key thing here was that we didn't rush the plan. What we did was we phased the plan so that we did it in incremental steps. So we didn't charge in and say, right, we'll throw in large numbers of building surveyors. We made the decision in the first instance to put a smaller number in so that we could work out the logistics, what we needed. If we made mistakes, we could correct them very, very quickly. Our job really was to develop the contact with building surveyors around the country through local government and the private sector, and also bring in the needs logistics in terms of what those individuals needed to provide us in terms of information, what equipment they needed to bring themselves, how they would travel in terms of meeting the response. We did a qualification check, which was very important, because one of the more interesting sort of side scenarios that we came up with was everyone wanted to get into Christchurch after the earthquake. Everyone wanted to see what was going on in Christchurch. And as a small country, a lot of individuals had relations down there. So we had to filter a lot of the inquiries that came through to make sure that we had the right people there with the right qualifications. We also needed to get approval from some of the employers as well, that should they leave their employment, they were actually guaranteed to go back to their employment, and they weren't leaving and going AWOL. And one of the key things, as I mentioned earlier, the safety first approach in locking down the CPD was crucial to maintaining control around how the program would work. And just to give you a little bit of an idea of the logistics. So the event was the 22nd. By the 23rd, we were managing the emergency response. By the 24th, which was basically the third day in, we had 42 teams on the ground, and we'd already done 2,300 residential inspections or assessments. 5 days after that, we had 100 teams on the ground, and we'd done 4,700 inspections a day. We were doing 4,700 inspections a day. 7 days after we had the first tranche in there, we had 216 teams on the ground, and we were doing 11,700 inspections during the day. So quite considerable. The day after that, we had 236 teams on the ground, and we were doing 17,900 inspections a day. So the volumes were huge, the hours were massive, and Stu will talk about that shortly. So if we pop to the next one. One of the key things that we needed to do was we needed to communicate with everybody that we were linked to and everybody that we needed support from. So we developed a communication program, and we coloured it orange. So we were sending emails out on a regular basis to building control managers, advising them of what we were doing, so that they were very, very aware of our program. There were no surprises. We were giving them as much information as we possibly could, because particularly at local governments around the country, we needed their support for them to release individuals. So we were explaining to them what was happening on a daily basis. This is just one example. So that's sort of 6 days after the emergency response. And I'll let you read that yourself from the notes. But effectively, we're always making a strong plea for those individuals to release people on a regular basis, because within 3 days on the ground, the surveyors were extremely tired, very, very weary, and we made the rule that 3 days was enough. Then we'd pull them out, would send them back to their home area, and if necessary, we'll bring them back in 3 or 4 days later. Next, please. Right. We also did a communication with all of our members, which was slightly different, but still in orange, which just kept them up to speed and gave them information that was important to them in terms of moving around the country, but also moving around the city environment as well. And this one just highlights the fact that the centre of operations had moved from the art gallery at the centre of the city out to a sports stadium further out of the city. Next, please. And one on, thank you. You'll see on that slide there that we had to develop systems on the run, and interestingly enough, there were only 2 people in our organisation that ran this show. It was myself and my EA, and we worked literally seven days a week, 24 hours a day. We were literally sleeping in the office, keeping things going. Thousands of emails, hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. Very exhausting, but very rewarding experience. Next, please. So, what were the key issues in the process? Regular and accurate communications, and ensuring the development, or that we developed a checklist for all volunteer communications. Logistically, I think that paid off. Our processes paid off. There's a letter here from one of the people we put into the Christchurch area. This basically says that it was a well-oiled machine. It was certainly an experience that made them proud. The days were extremely long and hard. Stu will talk about that shortly, but it was a 7 o'clock start and going on to sometimes dusk for a finish. And it was emotional, hugely emotional. And I know our friends from Nepal and Japan will have experienced that as well. A bit of post-response analysis. I guess the strengths of what we call Operation Suburb were the immediate identification that our organisation could provide support to the structured and more formal approach. In fact, I am quite sure that if we weren't involved, it would have been a lot slower process. And I just go back to what David was saying, and I think it was the 1989 Loma Puerta one. It took a long time to get people in there. I would have been involved. The other key was that we developed a very clear phasing or waving in of building surveyors so that we could manage the process. If we made errors, we could correct them quickly, and using locals and South Island locals very quickly as the first response wave, and then bringing people from the rest of the country in afterwards, and then also ensuring that we had a standby readiness message floating around. In terms of weaknesses, which is the next one, there's no doubt that I think that the relationship and the inflexibility of the civil defence process was a problem, and there were instances of non-professionalism within the government ranks and in the civil defence process, and I can recall making a call into what we call the bunker to ring my contact, and the individual had turned his phone off and left a message to say, I've turned my phone off because it was ringing too much. So there were some real problems in the element of professionalism within the government bureaucracy, in my view. Otherwise, there were issues around a lack of thought into managing the process when you need volunteers. How do you get, what are the travel authorisations? What are the funding authorisations? Who gives the authority for people to leave work and so forth? Those practical issues hadn't been thought through at the time. Next, please. So one of the big things that we came up with as a post-response requirement was there needed to be a single point of contact within the government bunker, and there wasn't for us. So we were always fighting 2 or 3 levels of phone calls to get to where we needed to do. But persistence paid off, and we always got what we wanted. I guess the other thing that came to light was there needed to be a more focused training regime for building professionals, and that's been mentioned here already. And interestingly enough, that process is now in place in New Zealand, and is now underway. So I'm going to finish there and hand over to Stu Geddes, who's going to talk to you about his experiences on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you.